Okay, so hello everybody. It's great to see you. Nothing like seeing a packed room here and a packed screen in Zoom world. Maybe there's something special going on tonight, and we definitely have something special for you. I'm Angela Madrid. I'm the president of the Rocky Mountain Mapped Society, and on behalf of our members, welcome everybody. We have the opportunity that you can come here and also be out there in the comfort of your home. We want to thank very much the History Colorado, Sean. Thank you so much for allowing us to be on this beautiful place. If you have not been here, you should. There's also a great exhibit going on that has to do with maps. It's about the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, a very influential treaty that actually defined the border between the United States and Mexico. And it's not here, but it had a map in there that confused that border all the way up to now, up to today. So, but it's a fantastic exhibit for you to come here and enjoy it. We're going to get started. And first, before introducing our speaker and the topic, I want to have the person that runs all of the programs here at the society and that is responsible for everything that you get to enjoy here is Naomi Heiser, that is going to tell us about what's coming up. And then I'll be back. So you can have this one.
Okay. Can everyone hear me? Good. Well, welcome. Just want to let you know about the next two spring programs. On April 11th, we have Eliane Dotson with a program called What is My Map Worth? How to Value Antique Maps. And just to let you know, this one is only on Zoom this time. She wasn't able to travel to Denver, so she will present on Zoom. That'll be nice and comfortable for everyone. You can enjoy her talk with a beverage and sit back. The next thing we have is pretty exciting. It's Map Month. We're going to revive it this year. So it's called Map Mayhem this year, and it's all going to be here at History Colorado with the theme of mapping historical Denver. So there'll be 4 talks by our own Rocky Mountain Map Society folks: Wes Brown, who's right here, Chris Lane, Chris is here, Tom Overton, and Steve Hoffenberg are all going to do talks about different aspects of the history of mapping up until the founding of Denver and early Denver. So you've probably seen the schedule and the synopses of these talks if you get our email newsletter. If you're not on our email list and want to sign up, come see me. We'll put you on the list so that you can get these descriptions. And you can also see the talk descriptions on our website. So they'll all be on Tuesday evenings, but at 6 instead of 5:30. So you just have to keep that in mind. It's a little different, and it'll be 4 of the 5 Tuesdays in May. All right, that's my announcements. Thank you.
Thank you, Naomi. That's one of the few things that the pandemic left us, the opportunity to enjoy these talks from everywhere around the nation in terms of maps. But we have a great program for you tonight. Introductions for events like this and lectures like this are pretty straightforward most of the time. You have a speaker that is going to talk about a topic. So you got the subject and the subject matter, no confusion. But when I was preparing my remarks for this talk, I found myself extremely confused. There was no separation between these two topics, and I'll tell you why. I want you to pay attention to a thing that I'm going to read you here, which is the topic that we're going to talk about. And this is taken exactly from their program. So we're going to talk about a woman that was an influential educator. She broke new ground in female education and was widely known for her books related to maps. Central to this success was her conviction that history and geography were not just interdependent subjects, but best learned through visuals. So that's the subject matter. Now let me read you about the speaker that is going to talk about this topic. This is a woman that is a very influential educator, that she has broken ground in female education, and that is widely known for her books related to maps. And central to this success is her conviction that history and geography are not just interdependent subjects, but best learned through visuals. So I thought, is this an autobiography that Susan is going to talk about herself? No, it is not. It's about 2 influential and wonderful women that coincide in a single topic. One is a 21st century woman that is the university professor of history at University of Denver, Susan Schulten, and that, in my opinion and the opinion of many, has infused this topic of maps and cartography with extra energy. Her love for history, her love for thematic maps has unraveled a lot of the obscure maps that we have never been able to learn about, and she has explained all of that very well. You can see it through all the books that she had written: A History of America in 100 Maps, Mapping the Nation, Geographical Imagination in America, and she just wrote a book, just published, and you can see a copy there. There's only one copy, and she when she writes about her 19th century counterpart, kindred spirit, Emma Willard, and Susan has very nicely and succinctly named this topic or this lecture as How Emma Willard Mapped Time. So welcome, Emma, and welcome, Susan, and to talk to us about mapping time. So, this one way up high.
Thank you all for coming. I appreciate that introduction. I'm not sure I'm the same as Emma Willard. I'm not sure she's a kindred spirit. What I hope to demonstrate to you this evening is that she was quite a handful and definitely broke new ground. Before I get started, there are some people I definitely need to thank. Thank you all for coming out on a cold Tuesday evening in March, March being our most unpredictable month. And I want to especially thank three folks who have made so many of these programs possible and who have been so good to me, particularly this last year. Angel, my favorite rocket scientist, who has been such a supportive co-collaborator and who shares my passion for understanding the way in which the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo transformed North America. Naomi Heiser, who's been so gracious to me, particularly this last year or two, and who many of the images that you'll see, much of the photography that was done courtesy of her colleagues at the University of Colorado Library, particularly Adrian Wagner, whose work you'll also see, her incredible photography in the book. There's a copy of the book right behind me. I also brought a couple extra copies because I'm vain and hoping to sell them. And I'll also show you the place if you're interested where you can buy it online. And the last person I'd like to thank is the reason I'm here in the first place, and that's Wes Brown, who actually exactly 20 years ago called me up out of the blue on a landline, both on landlines, because that's what we did back then. And he found me in my office, and he had just come across my first book, The Geographical Imagination in America, and said, "You should join our Map Society." And I did. I came to the next meeting, and I've been coming ever since. And so many of you know what a tremendous work Wes has done here and around the world in promoting popular interest in maps. So with all those thank yous, I will get started. As Angel said, I'm someone who's been long interested in Emma Willard, who was one of the most influential educators in 19th century America. I know many of you online and also in the room share my interest in Willard, which is why my email address is up there. I absolutely love corresponding with folks, co-conspiring over our shared interests. And if you have comments tonight that we don't get to in the Q&A, I hope you will reach out to me, because I'm always discovering new material about Willard from folks around the country. And the way this all started was in the early months of the pandemic, when all of us were really beside ourselves with anxiety and distraction. I got a call from a guy named RJ Andrews, who's on the call as well. RJ is a graphic information creator. He develops information graphics of the type that you'll see in newspapers, online, and he's sort of the latest iteration of what Emma Willard was doing in the 19th century. How can you visualize information in a way that makes people understand complicated, vast databases of information? And RJ called me because he had an idea. What he wanted to do was to create a series of books, and it's starting out with 3, which have all just been published together, a series of books that would do justice to the folks in the 19th century who were some of the greatest pioneers of information graphics. That included E.J. Marais in France, Florence Nightingale, and here in the United States, Emma Willard. And he asked me if I'd be interested in writing the volume on Willard. He had known my work. We had traded notes over the years. He himself was a fanatic for Willard's graphics. And I jumped at the opportunity. We were all in lockdown. There weren't No one was going anywhere soon to do archival work, but I had the tremendous good fortune of being at the University of Denver, which owns a copy of Emma Willard's materials and manuscripts on microfilm, partly because I asked them to buy them 15 years ago. I've been working on Emma Willard for a long, long time. And so that opportunity gave me a tremendous sense of purpose in pandemic when so many of us were struggling, trying to find our way in this new normal. And so in the short time I have tonight, I'd like to focus on one aspect of what I put together in that period, and that is to focus on the graphic legacy that Willard left for us, how she put her stamp, if you will, on the way in which we see information, particularly the way we visualize time and history. And to do that, I'm going to need to go back and give you a little bit of a sense of her remarkable birth and early life. The one thing I want to put on your radar before we jump into the visuals, now that I think about it, is that there is a theme for tonight. The way in which I have come to think about Willard's contribution is that this is a woman whose graphics at every turn grew out of her life experience. She was born in 1787, just as the Constitutional Convention was opening in Philadelphia. She was the last of 17 children, and she was reared by a father who had been active in the revolution. And she said, I took in patriotism at my father's knee, like my mother's milk. In other words, she was raised to be devoutly patriotic, and you'll see where that manifests. But the theme I want you to think about when you think about her life experience shaping her graphics is simply the word expansion. This is a woman who is living through transformational expansion in a couple different ways. One, in terms of her own life, the new presumption after the revolution that women deserved an education outside the home. Emma Willard was one of the first girls to be educated outside her own home. And that generation became path breakers, if you will, for the girls that followed. Second, it's not just female education, but by the 1830s, she is part of a way in which, a transformation in America that is now assuming that education should be available to all. In other words, public schooling is an invention of the 1830s and 1840s. Right when she is really hitting her stride, she is seeing a vast increase in the number of students and the preparation they had to be educated. Expansion in terms of technology. She was coming of age with canals, then railroads, and then the telegraph. Rapidly expanding human mobility in space, and also the transfer of information. And then last but not least for Angel is the territorial expansion that absolutely transformed American life. Most importantly in the 1840s with the victory of the United States over Mexico and the cessions of land that came in that wake. All of those experiences hit Willard like a succession of waves. And you'll see the way in which those transformative, expansive developments forced her to think differently about information. So let's go back to her early life, if we can. It always works this way. Okay.
So you can forward and backward.
Yep, very good.
Okay.
Yes. As I said, she's born in 1787, and by her preteen into teenage years, she is being educated in the local schools. She is living in the suburbs, or at the outskirts, if you will, of Hartford, Connecticut, and that is fortuitous. Hartford is in the heart of the Connecticut River Valley, and the Connecticut River Valley was the birthplace of some of the most important innovations around education. It was also the heart of female education, and we'll talk about why that matters. I'm showing you just two sort of typical products of that education. She was going, like I said, she was among the first generation of girls to be educated outside the home. And the female schools that were popping up all through the Connecticut River Valley were very much geared to a certain kind of education, giving young girls the basics of grammar, composition, arithmetic, and geography. And so what you see at left was the most widely read and studied geography of that time, Jedediah Morse, whose books remained in print from the 1780s through the 1820s. And you'll notice that it is quite literally a textbook. It is a book of text. And primarily for technological reasons, those books of that era were very, very heavy on words and very light on graphics. And that was something that really hit home to Willard. No matter how good her teachers were, these were the tools that they were using. On the right, what you'll see is an embroidery, a sampler, if you will, that was quite typical of that time, depicting charity. And I show you that. It's from Miss Patton's school. Miss Patton's was one of the most reputable female schools in that era that Willard briefly attended for one term. Many girls would just go to one school for one term, then go home, and then go to another school for another term. It wasn't consistent the way we understand it to be today. But I show you that because that was one of the elements of Willard's education that she was most irritated by. You don't teach a girl to sew. You teach her to make these elaborate, decorative, fanciful entertainments, right, for display. And she thought that was exactly the wrong way in which to go about education. So I'm showing you these two elements of her education to tell you and show you two things that made her really frustrated. And that frustration about what her education lacked would really drive what she, in turn, made sure other girls had in their education. But as frustrated as she was by the embroidery at the right, I think it gives us a clue. And that is the female education at the turn of that century, the turn of the 19th century, was highly visual. There was lots of sewing and painting, drawing, those types of what we might call decorative arts, right? And that was really brought home, both the possibility, but also the limits, when in 1806, she gets a break. She gets to go on a spring break, if you will. And she's in Hartford. She can't go all the way back to Berlin. So she goes nearby to her family's home, her extended family, the family of her cousin. And they had an enormous library, and she was in heaven. And she found among those books an oversized drawing manual, the manual of Lebrun's Passions, rooted in the 17th century and remaining in print forever. Everybody knew this. This was the drawing book. And it was reprinted and repackaged lots of times, updated, abridged. But that was the way you learned. And Lebrun was known for his use of geometric approaches and especially symmetry in order to depict and capture human emotion. That was his real contribution, is expressive facial depictions. And so Emma Willard tells the story, and she recalls it from decades later, of excitedly taking the book down and opening it up, getting a piece of paper out and a pencil and beginning to draw, and realizing immediately that she was stymied, that she was limited, that she couldn't go any further because no one had ever taught her geometry. And I want you to let that sit for just a minute. From an early moment, she understood that if you're going to master anything out of Lebrun, and more importantly, if you're going to understand perspective, dimension, you have to have some understanding of geometry. And I tell you that because that's one of the formative experiences that shapes her understanding of how you teach and how you understand visualization. Okay. Here's where things begin to get really interesting from my perspective. No sooner is she finishing her own education as a teenager, she's starting to get work in the Connecticut River Valley as a teacher herself. She takes over as an apprentice at one school, then she takes a kind of a TA position at a school a little bit further, and she takes on several of these in Connecticut and then in Massachusetts until finally she gets her own school. She gets to take over the Middlebury Female Academy in 1807 in Middlebury, Vermont. And I know you might be thinking, oh, is that the Middlebury Female Academy, that lovely building surrounded by grounds? And no, it's not. She gets there and she finds out that the Middlebury Female Academy is in a ramshackle, cold, unheated building And it looks directly on that very nice Middlebury College, exclusively open for men, that had just opened its doors in 1800. And she's pretty annoyed. She's also annoyed because every time she asks if she can just sit in on a class, if she can just observe what the men get to learn there, she is told no, it would be too disruptive. And I tell you that because that is something that really stuck in her craw, and she'll remember it later. But in the short term, the Middlebury Female Academy was fairly straightforward at the time, offering the same kind of education that she herself had received. And she works at it for a few years and she enjoys it, however limited the options that are being given to her, and circumscribed the curriculum, until she meets a man named John Willard, a much older man who is a wonderful husband to her, and she gets pregnant. And so she steps away from teaching for a few years, but then the family falls on some financial hard times and she really does need to go back to work. Now, she doesn't necessarily need to do what she does next, which is rather than go back to work at Middlebury Female Academy, she starts her own school. And here we have in 1814, the first ad that I could find, very, very typical. I have hundreds and hundreds of advertisements like this for the female schools that littered the Northeast. This one is quite typical. A boarding school for young ladies will be commenced at Middlebury by Willard on the second Monday of May next. Reading, writing, arithmetic, English, grammar, geography, drawing, painting, and embroidery. Very, very typical. And actually what she's doing here, no matter how frustrated she was with that traditional curriculum, she realizes that the mothers and fathers of Middlebury have very clear expectations about what their daughters will learn. In other words, the success of her school will rise and fall on enrollments. And so she adopts that very traditional curriculum for the first few years of her school. And every morning she walks out of her home where she's boarding these young women and looks across the street at Middlebury College and what the boys at Middlebury have access to. The tremendous learning, the library, the curriculum that's far wider, the tutorials, the faculty, all of it makes her realize that something is very, very wrong. A couple of years ago at auction, and all of you know how deeply tied we all are to the maps that come up at auction, a remarkable item went up for sale. It doesn't look very remarkable, I know, but if you look very closely, and I've typed it out for you, it's Eliza Henshaw's journal from her time at Miss Willard School in 1816. What we have here is the journal of one of the first girls that Emma Willard taught beyond the traditional age of 17 or 18. She called Henshaw one of her first and finest scholars. Henshaw at the time was 18, and she took those girls from 18 to about 20 or 21. In other words, what she's trying to do is to give a new generation of girls the opportunities that those boys had across the street at Middlebury. And what she's teaching Miss Henshaw is advanced rhetoric, natural science, and also taking them a step beyond that Jedediah Morse textbook to much more sophisticated geography. So astronomy, for instance. The thing I want you to notice here out of the pages of Henshaw's journal is that the text that I'm not showing you, that Henshaw inscribed in the journal, is quite typical. It's word for word out of contemporary textbooks, either Jedediah Morse or William Goldsmith, the two most common. But here, what she's trying to teach Henshaw is that there are ways in which you can visualize this material that will imprint it on your mind. And she does this with astronomy, and she starts to flirt with having her students do it with geography. Now, to our eyes, this might not look like a remarkable page. At right is the text, like I said, straight out of Morse, right? Just copied. But what's remarkable at left, and I'll show you this in just a minute, is that this looks nothing like the maps that young girls were being taught to make in the Connecticut River Valley in the early 19th century. They were taught to make maps every day, maps that would occupy their attention for months, that would be exacting, that would require incredible discipline, right? And artistic exactitude. Instead, what Willard is having Henshaw do is draw maps freehand. because what she wants her students to understand is not creating a map that mimics a printed map. She wants her students to understand geography as relative position. And the way you can notice that is that this is Eliza Henshaw's map of Scandinavia. Her younger sister, Frances, had a journal made across the street at the old Middlebury Female Academy, the more traditional, the first school that Emma Willard worked at. And look at how different it is. Also came up at auction about 15 years ago. It is out of the David Rumsey collection. So here's younger Frances Henshaw's book of penmanship, executed about 7 years later. And I'll zoom in on her typical map of Connecticut here. Oh, I won't zoom on. But you can see how exacting it is, how the shoreline is represented in order almost with the precision that mimics a printed map, how color is so important. And it's Frances Henshaw here whose maps were far more typical at that time. In other words, when young girls were being taught, as they were widely, to make maps in the 19th century, it was about artistic execution, to be displayed during the end of term recitation, to be judged, to be ranked, right, to be awarded medals. That kind of thing drove Willard crazy. And her sister was just as illustrious an educator. And both of them in the 30s and 40s thought back and said, you're not going to believe this, but the kind of thing that passed for geography education for young girls at the turn of the 19th century was ridiculous. They were essentially tracing maps. Now, I find these maps beautiful. I hope to write a book about them someday. They command tremendous prices on the market. But the point I want to make is that Willard finds this to be completely unrelated to any understanding of geography mentally, right? It's copying, it's art, but it's not really imbibing or internalizing any understanding of geographic relationships. I talked about the frustrations that Emma Willard felt when she was teaching at that Middlebury Female Seminary. Yes, she could enroll those scholars, if you will, up to the age of 20, and she was doing tremendously well. Every year she had more students. There was no problem with the survivability of the school. But she realized by 1818, 1819, that if there was going to be a transformation of female education, it couldn't happen school by school. There had to be something done at the state level in Vermont. And so, like I said, with that very supportive husband, she publishes a pamphlet trying to convince the legislature that there needs to be a statewide support of female education. These schools, they are founded, they survive for 1 or 2 or 10 years, but female education was entirely dependent on the willingness of the local community to send their girls to those schools. It was nothing like the kind of support that male education had. And so with this pamphlet, her plan for improving female education, she excitedly prints up copies at her own expense. She has her husband pull out all the stops and all his connections. She gets an audience with the governor, and it's crickets. There's absolutely no support for it. She asks, may I use an abandoned building in Burlington to open up a wider school where I might train teachers? No, right? There's no support, and she's furious. And so you can see her memory from many decades later. My boarding school was opposite the college in Middlebury, and my pupils had brothers there. With their learned president and professions, I was well acquainted and knew all their superior advantages. I bitterly felt the disparity between the facilities of the two sexes. I could not and would not believe that men willingly and with reflection did us this injustice. In other words, if we just showed them the problem, they jump at the opportunity to support us. And when they don't, she packs up and her husband follows, and she goes across the river to New York. And she moves first to Westerfield and is there for a few years, and then she moves again to Troy, New York. And I want to just think for a minute about what's going on in Troy, New York, adjacent to Albany in the 18 teens and 20s. It's a small place, you can see, it's just getting started. It's on the confluence of the Mohawk and the Hudson River. And in 1825, the Erie Canal opens. So here's a woman who has a front a front row seat to the most transformational transportation technology to date in the 19th century. Dignitaries come, she gets to meet Lafayette when he comes to view and study the canal. She sees all kinds of commerce going back and forth from New York up the Hudson, then west to Buffalo. It's a transformational time. It's an incredibly exciting place to be. And partly for that reason, her school thrives. It's at the juncture of these different commercial upticks and also technologies. At exactly the same time, when she opens the Troy Female Seminary in 1821, she throws herself into publishing. First, she's collaborating with William Woodbridge on a two-part geography. He's doing the modern geography. She's a little annoyed by that, but his star is bigger than hers. And so she takes, by default, the ancient geography. In 1821, what I'm showing you here is the title page of her first textbook, the first of dozens that will follow. But it's exactly the same moment that she's opening this larger school with statewide support, or promise of statewide support from New York, that she's also beginning to realize that she can influence a tremendous population of men and women through textbooks, through printed works. So those two things are happening at the same time, a new school and a new publishing venture. So here she has her ancient geography, the first thing she's ever published. She's delighted by this newfound independence. And what I want to show you is even there at the get-go, her first publication, look at how she opens it. I'll zoom in for you. Before students even begin to read the text, she wants them to see a graphic. And in fact, from here forward, every textbook she publishes, the frontispiece will be a visual that helps tease the information for the students. Now, this one is a little bit wacky. It is the progress of the Roman Empire illustrated by the Amazon River. It's strange, but if you give it a minute, you'll see the conceit. And in the book, I spent a couple pages trying to get in her head. But what she's trying to show is the way in which the Roman Empire absorbed smaller civilizations and was enlarged as a result. And so it's both geographic to an extent. It's the Amazon River, different hemisphere, but she's using the idea of the Amazon to show change over time, coming through time down here to 107, okay, to the Roman Empire at its greatest extent. So even at this early moment of venturing into publishing, she's trying to think about the ways one might visualize time. Now, obviously, there's not great fidelity to geography here, right? And she realizes that there's always going to be a trade-off. But here she wanted students to see that if they had this picture in their head, then going forward and reading the text might help them fit the details into that larger visual. Okay. And then she's off to the races. A couple years after she publishes the ancient geography, she publishes an accompanying atlas. And this was quite typical for her, to publish a textbook and then an atlas that accompanied it. For her, the real money was always the atlas. The textbook was sort of secondary. And I'll tell you some about that in just a minute. But here's her ancient atlas, and I'll zoom in for you here. This map, which is showing the barbarian invasions across several centuries. The conceit of this one is not original to her. It's actually from a very, very popular historical atlas of that time, the Lesage Atlas, which Matthew Carey adapts in the United States. I'll zoom in for you here. The idea was to show over several hundred years how those tribes moved through Europe and North Africa. What I like about the way she did it, this is an atlas for young people, and so she has streamlined the information, showing only what is necessary so that the big picture is evident to her students. What's most remarkable to me about this is that this is the last page of her ancient atlas, and within a year, she publishes her subsequent project, which is an atlas devoted to American history, and uses the exact same technique to open that atlas. So this one is original to her. Obviously, she's gotten the ideas from others, But here's her series of maps looking at the history of the United States. And the first one, many of you know, I've made quite a lot of this map. It's important that we note that she sees the Native American, what she calls Aboriginal wanderings, as prehistory in North America. And in this sense, she is quite typical of her time. This is how most Euro-American scholars, teachers saw Native Americans, as the prehistory, right? The run-up or the prelude to the real action, which came post-Columbus. So she has thoroughly imbibed some of the racial and hierarchical assumptions of that era. But what I want you to think about here is the way she's trying to represent change over time on a map. Okay. She's doing this exactly in the way that her own experience in the classroom had taught her. At the Troy Female Seminary, every young girl was given a 2-foot by 3-foot slate with chalk. And at the beginning of every history lesson, what she had them do was to draw an era. And I'll show you what I mean by that. She thought that if students could think about history through space, they would have an easier time committing it to memory. And we should remember that in all of this era, the gold standard for an education is memorization. It's quite different from our understanding of what constitutes mastery. She wanted students to be able to read, understand, and remember. So if we zoom in here on her introductory map, you can see the creativity. She's trying to show the robust migrations that occurred in North America long before the Spanish, the Dutch, the French, the English arrived. Okay. And it collapses several hundred years onto a single image. Subsequent to that were her maps in a series. And like I said, these are precisely the maps that she had taught her students to draw in the classroom. And I'll zoom in for you here. So the first one here, it always strikes me as interesting and a little bit entertaining that for her, the first map that matters has a little vignette here. She always has a vignette of something important in that era of Queen Elizabeth giving the land grant to Sir Humphrey Gilbert. Now that's a failed charter, right? That's what's one of the many colonies, if you will, in North America that didn't last. But for her, because it was English, and remember, she's a very, very ardent American patriot, very proud of her colonial roots. She sees that as the first kind of most important iteration of what will become the United States. And if you zoom in here, I think I've got, yep, you can see what she's tried to do to engage the youngest minds with pictorial images of voyages, to attach them to the different imperial powers. You see the French, you see the Spanish. Up and above this, you'll see some of the Dutch. And she does that through time, through a series of what she calls epic maps, EPOCH, epoch maps. So you can go through here. I'm not going to show you much more, but I do want you to note, I think this is the only one. You can see she's also noticed the first arrival of African slaves that were sold in the Chesapeake in 1619. So she's trying to show notable moments and to put them on a map and giving the student a bigger picture of what's actually going on. Okay. This is an undated picture of the recitation room at the Troy Female Seminary. And what I want to note here is both her description of why pictures matter, but also take a look at what's on the walls. I'm pretty sure, given what I can tell about this image in high resolution, that this was student art that flanked the walls, and that for her, the best pathway to education, the best pathway to memory was always visual. And I'm struck by her recollection here when she's a very, very mature and well-known author. Mere straight lines not wrought into a picture and presenting no form or comeliness to the eye are unattractive. The young and the old do not feel any wish to look at them, and thus they carry away no distinct impression. They are like a succession of monotonous sounds, which no one remembers, while the arrangement of sounds in tunes or lines in pictures are attended to with pleasure and easily remembered. And for the next 10 years, after that succession of atlases in the 1820s that are pretty geographic, she's going to really struggle with how to best picture time. How do you visualize time? And the reason she's doing that is that she comes to a point in 1830 or so when she realizes maps are good as far as they can go. Yes, to some degree, they can represent history, but they're not fully capturing time, nor are the traditional timelines that are so popular at that moment fully capturing time. And so here things get to be really kind of wacky. What you'll see in the 1830s and 1840s are all her experiments with trying to visualize time in a way that makes sense to the brain. So in 1835, she publishes her atlas to accompany a universal history, which is what we would call a world history, trying to do all, everything that's important, which really meant primarily, European history, but they called it universal history. Now take a look at what she's tried to do in her most notable graphic from that atlas, and I'll zoom in for you here. She sometimes calls this the stream of time, the perspective sketch, the course of empire. It goes by a lot of different names for her. But what she's got here, and like I said, I'll zoom in for you here so you can make sense of it. Here's creation. Remember, she's firmly of her time and very, very devout Christian. Now, time comes down here into three eras: the ancient, the middle, and the modern. Time also, and you may not notice this because it's pretty subtle, time is also coming toward you very slightly. That's intentional. And also, time is much wider here in the present day than it is at creation. I'll show you what she's trying to do with all of this. There we have the birth of Christ, right? She's trying to show both with perspective and also with light and shading that there are more and less important periods in world history, okay? And she wants this to be on a single page. It's very important that there's a way in which the eye can see this all at once, she says, okay? So you see time becoming more important and getting more attention as civilizations broaden, as civilizations become more complex, as they interact. And you also notice here, and I think I can zoom in for you, that the Roman Empire is in light, followed by the Dark Ages, right? So she's trying to signal through light and darkness relative importance. An attempt here is made to exhibit history in its proper relative proportions. The painter allows to objects in space less and less room upon his canvas as those objects recede into the distance. Such is equally the order of nature in regard to objects as they exist in time. Yet the distant mountain must have more room in the picture than the dark valley that lies near. Thus tower Greece, Rome, amidst the dimness of antiquity, and thus sink the Dark Ages, though nearer to the foreground. So yes, in general, modern history is more important. It gets more space on the page, but she's also trying to show us here with light, but also here. Do you notice that some centuries get much more attention than others, much more space? She's also playing with time there to show that some periods are more important than others. And here's how we come down to the present. You can see what matters to her. Here's Columbus. Here's the Reformation. Thank God she has quite a few things to say about the Catholics. And then here we have American independence. And here's down to the present. Okay. So she's playing with all of this. Now, there are ways in which it's too clever by half. The geography doesn't always work spatially. You'll notice that some civilizations die out. Some have firm lines between them, and meaning like China, for instance, does not interact with others. Others do bleed together. So she's trying to play with world history through visual cues, but it doesn't always work, and she recognizes that. Okay. And then she pivots to something even more sort of remarkable in this way, and that is ways to visualize time through pictures. Okay. Now, I told you that her life experience really mattered. And here is where you can really see it on display. Her first husband passed away in the 1820s. She's devastated by that. And let's say she rushes into a second marriage, and it was not a good match. They end up having a terrible marriage, a vicious divorce. She's sure that he's trying to take her for her money. She's amassed quite a lot of savings by that time, both because of her school and because of her publications. And the reason that's important is that she moves from Troy back to Connecticut, where she has more connections, and the divorce laws are a little bit more liberal. Getting a divorce in 1840 is not an easy thing. And while she's there, back in Hartford, because of her connections, she's invited to become the superintendent of a local school district. Right at the time that, like we talked about, we're getting the growth of what are called common schools, what we would call public schools. And so she's going from the Troy Female Seminary, which are pretty posh, well-mannered, well-heeled kids, women, into a schoolroom where all of a sudden she's not in a tutorial with 5 or 6 kids, but she's looking out at a classroom like this of boys and girls, some immigrant, varying levels of literacy. And she realizes this is the future of education. And so for her, the light that goes on is that if graphics mattered to her fancy girls at the Troy Female Seminary, they sure as hell are going to matter for a much more diverse audience. And you can see the way she leans even further into graphics in the 1840s. So here's her very, very popular History of the United States, the abridged version, which had been originally written in the 1820s. It stays in print for decades. And what she's done in the 1840s is to give students, first and foremost, a graphic way of capturing all of American history, just in the way the Stream of Time tried to capture universal history. It is a tree. She spends an enormous amount of time explaining the way it works. It's complicated. It's both a tree, but also time goes this way, right? So it's a bit of a clock as well as a tree. Like I said, some of these graphics are a little too clever by half. But what they reveal to me is the way in which she's trying to understand the way a picture might ring into your brain a kind of permanent furniture for you to place the details that come later. Okay, so we've got, you go from the 16th century and the arrival of Columbus in 1492, all the way down to what was then the current day, 1841. And she updates the tree and adapts it, and it becomes the frontispiece for every edition of her textbook until the textbook goes out of print in the 1870s, right? So you can see the way she's again thinking about organic metaphors, a stream, a tree, to try to help people think about memory. What's extraordinary to me is that the next year, 1845, she turns it into a graphic on rollers. Now, we all came of age when maps and graphics like this on the wall were just a matter of course. But they only date so far back as public education itself. In other words, they are inventions of a classroom. They are made for a group of students just like this to be able to all have their eyes on the same thing rather than all reading their own textbooks. And so she sees that this is the way to really get her work out there, and she's elaborated it somewhat. But the whole idea is that what she's trying to do is educate teachers to try to educate groups of students, and groups of students, like I said, that were far more diverse than what she had encountered in her own private school. Make sure I'm on track here. She was most proud, like I said, to this point, of her Stream of Time. She hawked it relentlessly through the 30s. She would go spend a month here and there in different schools and try to get it to catch on in the way the textbook wars go on today. She was her own best advocate, but she realized pretty quickly that the nuances of the Stream of Time were lost. They were lost on teachers, and they were especially lost on students. And so she goes quite literally back to the drawing board in the early 1840s and comes back with what becomes her most notable and exciting and viral. You can go on the line. People love this. They send it all the time. You see it whips around the web. And in 1846, she publishes her Temple of Time. And I'll zoom in so you can see and appreciate what she's trying to do. What you may not notice, because I didn't notice it at first, is here is the stream. The stream forms the floor work of the temple. So you have creation here, the birth of Christ here, the Roman Empire there, it comes down. It's quite simplified from the original, but she realized that teachers weren't understanding what she was trying to convey, that there wasn't enough of a pictorial quality to it to really catch people's attention. And so she uses the framework of a temple. Now, you know that temples have long been used to represent time, to represent imagination, to represent genealogy, to represent history. This is not original to her. But the other thing that's fascinating to me is that this was designed to be an interactive visual. Students would be encouraged to create their own temples on the following model. Up here, the ceiling are individuals. Here, the columns are centuries. And so you have different groups of people, poets, painters, warriors, etc., according to different centuries. And in a blank version of this, the students would be encouraged to remember and to inscribe the different things that they had learned in the subsequent textbook. The result would be that students would create their own temples that would be kind of summaries of all of this information. Now, again, this is a mouthful, but I think it really gets to something fundamental about what we think a map really is. This is her in 1850. Like I said, she's quite proud. In a map, great countries made up of plains, seas, and rivers are represented by what is altogether unlike them: lines, shades, and letters on a flat piece of paper. But the divisions of the map enable the mind to comprehend by proportional space and distance what is the comparative size of each and how countries are situated with respect to each other. So this picture made on paper, called a temple of time, represents duration, time by proportional space. It is as scientific and intelligible to represent time by space as it is to represent space by space. When this map of time was completed, I was satisfied that my 30 years' work was done. In other words, she's remembering back to her earliest graphics in that Amazon history of the Roman Empire, that one of her greatest goals was to think about new ways to represent history. Or as she bragged to her girlfriend, in history, I have invented the map, right? She writes that privately, but she believes it. This is a woman with a tremendously healthy ego. She writes letters to Henry Clay and William Seward and Abraham Lincoln. She has ideas about how to stop the Civil War. So she's pretty confident. So you can see, and I think it's right. Sorry, here, she makes clear that her publisher, Alfred Barnes. Whoop. What did I do, Angel? I lost my. I want to go forward again. Whoop. Yep. She wants to make clear that her publisher puts front and center that this is trademark Emma Willard brand. And that's what she's trying to do. I want you to remember that with the rise of public education, what we have is also the rise of a very, very stiff textbook market in a time before copyright law. And so what she engages with when she's not creating new visuals is constant fights with other textbook authors about who invented what. She's always entangling with someone. And that's simply the case in the textbook market at the time. Everybody's angling for Ohio, the way today everyone is angling for the Texas textbook market. Okay. So it's this understanding that she has broken new ground in the mapping of time that really makes her feel as though she's placed her mark on American education. Now, to the final point of what Angel referenced before. This is published in 1846, right? And she's trying, like I said, to hawk all of these in the different states of the Union and even the Western territories. The teachers that she educates at the Troy Female Seminary, they go on to seed schools from as far north as Vermont down to the Mississippi frontier, right? And she is constantly traveling to meet all them and to promote her work. And then her attention is riveted by the conflicts in the Southwest. The United States declares war on Mexico in 1846, in the aftermath of the acquisition of Texas and statehood. And the war that ensues is thrilling to her. Like I said, she's an ardent patriot. She's someone who's firmly ensconced in the values of that time. And she is perhaps the most strong-minded defender of what we now term manifest destiny. This is a woman who also believed it was providential, that's her word, that the diseases that came with European contact in the Americas wiped out many of the Native American populations. This is something that to her is ordained. And manifest destiny is just the latest iteration for that. So she is absolutely delighted to read the progress of the war against Mexico. And she thrills at the conclusion of that war when the United States signs the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo and acquires massive lands in what we now understand to be the American West, right? Coincident with the negotiation of territory in the Northwest with England, with the United Kingdom. And so in 1849, the ink is not even dry on the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. She, in a rush, publishes Last Leaves of American History, which is essentially what's happened in the last 3 years with this war. For her, the hero of that war is John Fremont. She excitedly sends the proofs of her last leaves to his father-in-law, Thomas Hart Benton, who was a very avid expansionist himself. And so she's thrilled about the story of the Mexican War and what it means as the culmination of North American history, a continental nation, right? So she's lived through, at this point, decades of that growth. And for her, the acquisitions of this land are the fulfillment of America's purpose. And so much so that I want you to notice the first thing she publishes after Last Leaves. She translates her history into Spanish. She hires a translator in New York, Miguel Tolón, and she has him translate the entire history so she can publish it and gain a new market of school children and new citizens in the Southwest. And the preface is a little bit hard to read, but it's quite something if we're looking for evidence of attitudes of that time, explaining to the new citizens of the United States in the Southwest how fortunate they are to be American citizens and how she would very much like them to understand the history of this country, by which she means the history of English developments in the United States and the culmination in American independence. It's a remarkable document. And you can see here's her final chapter of that history, which begins with the signing of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo and ends at the present, 1851. The most remarkable thing to me about this Spanish language textbook is the little map she includes as the frontispiece. This is not something she thought a great deal about, but I want to end on this one because to me, however modest it is, I think this is the most influential graphic she ever created. It looks utterly ordinary to us, and you'll note, of course, that it's published in Spanish. Map of the United States divided historically and chronologically into 8 parts. This is a map that is so ordinary to our eyes, and she immediately does an English version of it, which I'll go to now when she publishes the second version of Last Leaves. This is a map that is so ordinary to us that we don't even understand what a radical statement it really is. It appears in every American history textbook from the time she designed this map until today. You can still find it in any ordinary United States history text. And what does it do after the US-Mexico War? It shows the United States free of conflict with clarified borders as a kind of organic process of expansion and growth. There's a seamless quality to it. And she thrilled at that. And in some ways, she doesn't think this is remarkable. She doesn't comment on it much in her private letters. But to me, this is one of the most influential things because it has become the furniture that Americans carry around in their heads about the inevitability of expansion. That America was simply the growth in 8 parts of progress from the colonization on the eastern seaboard until the fulfillment on the Pacific coast. And to me, that becomes a kind of substructure, if you will, for all kinds of assumptions we make about how America unfolded and the inevitability of something called manifest destiny. So with that, I'll close. I have a few images to show you from the book, but I've also taken a lot of time. The one thing I do want to show you, since we're all about branding these days, this was one of the greatest discoveries. I don't mean greatest like important, but the most exciting discoveries I made in the archives of the American Antiquarian Society. This is A.S. Barnes, her publisher from 1828-29 until she stops publishing. This is his trade list of books that he sends out to buyers. And I want you to notice that Willard is one of his most dependable authors, and that by the time that this trade list was printed in 1857, he has a whole stable of her textbooks. And you can see the Spanish language ones, the English ones, the map of time, the tree of time, all the ways that you can buy this for classroom use, for home enjoyment. To me, this is a remarkable coda, if you will. If you think back to her origin, if you think back to the way in which at 1800, she was one of those first girls to step out into the public for an education, to step outside the home. By the 1850s, she's fully engaged in what I called earlier that fierce textbook war in the fully established landscape of public education that has dominated the United States. So thank you. I appreciate your time.
Going to open up for questions here and in Zoom world. So who wants to start?
Go ahead, Chris. Nice to see you. Even with a mask, I can tell you. Yes. She draws the template. Oh, I'm sorry, Chris Citron's question is, did Willard actually draw the images that we saw printed? She draws the template and then she gives them to Alfred Barnes, and he hires a lithographer or an engraver, I would say, yeah, to do that. But no, those aren't in her hand, but she does the prototypes for them that you'll see. Yeah. And I can show you, I'm welcoming more questions, but I do want to show you the whole idea for this series is giving voice to what RJ thought were sort of three of the most important pioneers of information graphics. That's where you can buy it, Visionary Press. I'll warn you, it's very expensive. It was all printed in Italy between the high quality of the print work that we've done, but also supply chain issues. We had a hard time getting it done on time. The Willard book, the first half of it is devoted to her life and her work through a series of images and my interpretive essay. And then what we've done in the second half is to reproduce her entire visual catalog from her first publications, that first ancient geography, down to her last tree of time, and her other texts in the 1850s and 60s. So we've shown the images, but also given extensive captions to try to explain. And the last thing, I know I should stop talking, but we also discovered a few unknown Willard graphics. So for instance, this is the English chronographer, which we thought was lost to history. We saw a reference to it in her papers, but no one had ever found it. And we found it in the Library Company of Philadelphia, another high point of pandemic, thanks to wonderful archivists who answered our calls. Go ahead, Chris. Yeah. Did she write more like that? Oh, yes, she. Well, that's where things get even more interesting. This is a woman who believes firmly that female education should mimic male education, that women can learn anything that men can, in part because she could. She taught herself geometry, for instance, right, on her own. And yet, she also educates Elizabeth Cady Stanton at the Troy Female Seminary. She is absolutely opposed to women's suffrage. She thinks the Seneca Falls Convention is an embarrassment. This is actually quite typical, right? You're nodding your head that there were quite a few women in that time who thought that the suffrage was the worst possible avenue for women to pursue. So feminist is not a word she would really know what to make of, but she does believe that women should have full access to education. And by the way, given her second husband, property rights. Right. I'm sorry, Chris, I interrupted you. Go ahead. To the facilities. Yes, right. Yes, but she's a complicated woman. She's frustrated with Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and Elizabeth Cady Stanton is frustrated with her. So it goes both ways. Yeah. Other questions? Go ahead.
What were her sources of knowledge?
Mm-hmm. Great question. She is mostly reading the typical in-print histories, geographies of that time. She has access to slightly newer editions because she usually attaches herself to a local library or a patron. And so I saw some wonderful correspondence between herself and one of her students. The students wrote some of the text of some of the textbooks that she published. And she's recommending to them, go to your local library and get your hands on this latest atlas, for instance, or this newest geography. But it was primarily published materials that she was using. Yeah. Yeah.
What was her advice to Abraham Lincoln?
Oh. The question was, what was her advice to Abraham Lincoln? And this is fascinating to me as a Civil War scholar and a Lincoln scholar. She believes that she can turn around the secession crisis. And to be honest, it's not, it's hard to talk about. It's mostly about giving in to the South, right? She has some pretty clear ideas about abolitionists raising problems that aren't really real problems and raising issues that we should just let lie. She is firmly anti-slavery, but there are limits to how far she'll go there. And so on the eve of the Civil War, during the secession crisis, she writes a petition along with some other women about how to avert that problem and sends it to Seward and also to Lincoln. But it's mostly about, it's kind of along the same lines as the Crittenden Compromise and other compromises that were circulating in late 1860, early 1861, which is to say, let's just give the South what it's asking for, which is, you know, more robust protections for slavery in the West, for instance, and ask the Republican Party to step back on its anger and its frustration around slavery in the territories. Do you see? So it's those kinds of, it wasn't anything particularly original, but she was very confident that they ought to listen. That's one of the complicating things about her, is she's quite certain of her own talents, right? And yet, to Chris's point, there are some ways in which she sees there should be very clear limits on women's rights. Yes. Sean.
So what are her long-term influences on culture knowledge mapping? I see that there's an Emma Willard School in Troy, New York.
Yes, yes. So the Willard School, I work very closely with them. The earliest iterations of this research, I presented at their annual celebration of Emma Willard last year. Yes, the Troy Female Seminary becomes the Emma Willard School. So it just simply renames itself in the 20th century. And I think that has to do with Russell Sage's wife, who was a big philanthropist and a former student of that school. So that school has a tremendous imprint still, right? Especially in the Northeast. In terms of graphics, I think that that's more complicated. Because one thing I'll be candid about, a lot of these weird images that we look at, right? It's not as though they get widely copied. In other words, I think we should be honest that some of her graphics don't necessarily catch on, if you will, right? They're a little bit complicated. So I'm not going to claim that everybody else comes in her wake. And in fact, this is just the way of education. New educators rising in the age of John Dewey trash her because she's all about memorization. Do you see? And so, that's so typical in education. First thing you do is, right, undermine what came before you. And they think they can do it better, move away from memorization, more toward a student-centered approach. But the visual dimension, I think, is something worth paying attention to, because what she was thinking about is, how are you going to educate a much broader population that comes from a vastly wider socioeconomic pool, right? And so that, I would say, is one of it. And also the insistence that history and geography always be linked. She's not necessarily followed in that sense, but some of us believe that that's a pretty important pathway. Yeah. Oh, Douglas, hi.
Expansion, one that has different colors.
Yeah.
My eyes aren't fixed on these. These have very blurring for map. Is that just an error on part of you?
Oh, that's a coloration issue. Yeah, these were colored after they went to the printer. So no, there's no. I'll go double check, but I think that's just yeah. She was pissed though, right? I mean, it was frustrating to her. Yeah, and she had some choice things to say about folks in Middlebury, right? And their ossified, hidebound culture. But no, yeah. Anybody online that?
There's one comment.
Oh,
Actually, you might like it. Maybe you can talk about it. Can you read it so people online can hear you?
it's interesting that the inventory list is called history and mythology. Yes, well, it's got some ancient, right? The Dwight's Grecian and Roman mythology. Yes. Yeah, and there's a lot of little curlicues and cul-de-sacs in 19th century vernacular, right, around education that are different today, right? In the way that we've kind of regimented and separated out different disciplines. They were much more mixed in together in the 19th century. Go ahead.
So her ideas of relative geography versus kind of rote memorization, did that kind of have any sort of staying power, or did that sort of kind of go away?
Well, one thing I think is pretty interesting is that when she and her sister start to really critique that early form of female education that was so rote and exacting and artistic, those go out of fashion. That practice dies. But it's also dying because girls are now being educated alongside boys. In other words, part of the reason for having girls spend a month on a map, right, is like, idle hands at the devil's workshop. You got to keep these girls busy. And in the first days of female education, it wasn't quite clear what we're going to teach them. And those were really nice long-term projects. And they suited, you were practicing penmanship, and you were practicing coloration and discipline, right? And all these other skills, as well as geography, quote unquote. But yes, the people who collect those schoolgirl maps really lament that they don't exist after, say, 1830, right? It's really the peak of them is really, I would say, from 1810 to 1825. That's when you see them most commonly assigned. Yeah, but it's kind of a casualty of both co-education, but also with the rise of cheap printing, you can get cheap atlases. Do you see? And students can fill in the blanks, fill in the borders. But prior to that time, when she was being educated, you made your own maps. Yeah.
Did she ever go abroad?
Yes, she did go abroad. The question is whether she ever went abroad. And the most impactful time was she spent 6 months after her husband died in Europe with her daughter in 1830. Yep, mostly in France. And published a journal and some letters that talk a lot about how they're learning geography. And spoiler alert, she's doing it better in the US. She wants to make sure everybody knows. The French are way, far behind us, much more elementary. But yes, she does go abroad, I think. And then there's a second time in the 1850s. Yes. Yeah, she's also very proud that her Temple of Time wins an award at the Crystal Palace World's Fair in 1851. She tells everybody that. Go ahead.
We have another one online. What did she say about the Catholic
Oh,
Church?
that was a little bit gratuitous on my part. She's wholly of her time in the sense that one of the most common concerns in the 1840s and 50s with the massive immigration to the United States from Ireland was that this country was becoming way too Catholic, way too quickly. And if you think about the 2-3 million Irish that come to this country in the 1840s and 50s, well, Douglas, you know this, you studied this with me. The Know Nothing movement, right? These are people who are very much desperate, very much uneducated. And so Americans, particularly in cities like Philadelphia and Boston and New York, organize virulently against Catholics and organize a political party that becomes the American Party. And it dies out in the 1850s as slavery becomes the greater concern. But her concerns about the Catholic Church are primarily motivated by the massive Irish immigration in that period. Very much typical at that time. Like I said, she's complicated, right? There are no heroes in history, but there are a lot of interesting characters. So,
One more question here and one more.
go ahead. Yeah.
Back to the question of her cultural legacy for a minute. It seems to me that I've seen on many people's walls, torn out, people end up time streams of world history of various sorts from, I don't know if it's Time Life books or various modern magazines. Is she ever given credit for being the inventor of that form?
Well, she's not the innovator. The question was about the vogue for timelines, right? Timelines as we understand them, so representing time in discrete spatial pieces, is an invention of the mid 18th century with Priestley and Dubourg and these guys who come to this idea that a line can represent chronology. She rejects that because for her, there's no nuance there and there's nothing to make it stick. In other words, all time is the same. And for her, as you saw, some periods are simply more interesting and important than others. So if anything, she is rejecting the traditional timeline and trying to do more with it. But what you'll notice is that timelines persist, right? That you were referencing. And
Well, line is one thing, but a stream of concurrent
mhm.
events happening in different parts of the world or in different subject matter categories. Was she the inventor of that, where there's concurrent things happening at the same on not just a line, but a
Coincident or coterminous. Mhm.
yeah.
Yeah, she's not. There are some European innovators there. And the best book on this, if you're interested, it's very good. It's by Anthony Grafton and Rosenberg is the other author. I'm forgetting his first name, but it's called Cartographies of Time. And they see the real path breakers in the 18 teens and 20s in Germany and England. And she's obviously in the same way she was taking some of those barbarian invasion representations of time, she's also adapting those European ones. Nothing looks quite like hers. These are also in vogue because there's quite a lot of millennial religions. And so the question is, how much time is left before the return of Christ and all that. So they become really popular in the I would say the antebellum era. Hers are the most widely adopted in schools because she's primarily publishing for a textbook market.
Final question from.
Last question. Yes.
Just repeat it.
Just read this.
Did she appreciate what Florence Nightingale was doing with visual graphics? That's something that RJ and I would love to know. Florence Nightingale is primarily working in the 1850s. So sort of when Willard is sort of done with some of her innovations, right? She's really innovating up to, I would say, about 1854. And Nightingale, as I understand her, is slightly later. She may know about Nightingale, but we haven't been able to come across any information that either knew what the other was doing. Yeah, that's a thesis for someone else.
On that note,
Yeah.
thank you.
Thank you so much. Yeah.
I think you will agree that this was a fascinating talk from a 21st century outstanding scholar of a 19th century outstanding and complex educator. Thank you so much for all of you for being here. And thank you so much, everybody online. It was a great attendance for a great talk. We'll see you next time. Bye.